Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. So we thought we start off this school with a very easy lecture. No mathematics. It's Monday morning. It's early. I'm not a morning person. So just a lightweight introduction to the problem and set the scene. And I hope you're not insulted by the level of the slides because it's very easy, but I can promise you the rest of the week will be harder and we'll dive deep into the math. So I'll try to just give you an overview of the scene, explain you how important cryptography has become in society. I guess you're all aware of the quantum threat, otherwise you wouldn't register for this course, but at least I'll give you a bit of a historic perspective on it, and then show you a bit what's happening, so it may help you to put all the other lectures in perspective. But for the real hard details, I refer you to the lectures later this week. So I'll just start really very basic, a few things about cryptography, then I'll discuss the quantum threat and the response of PQC, and if time left, I'll say a few things about UKD as well, because that always comes up in discussions related to this. So cryptography is about these two characters, Alice and Bob. And cryptography is as old as writing itself. And Alice and Bob want to communicate securely over an open channel. And historically, cryptography was for kings, generals, and diplomats. But as we will see, cryptography is a mass product today. So what you do in cryptography is you transform your plain text into ciphertext and then on the other side back. And of course, to have security, you have two options. Either you keep the algorithm secret, which is not really the preferred option anymore. You shift the secrecy to keys, just like we work with locks. So cryptography is about moving secrecy or protection of data to protection of keys. That's really what we are doing on a day-to-day basis. And what you see here is cryptography for protecting communications. We also use cryptography for protecting stored data. And then the latest trend, the latest development where academia, but also some startups are working on is protecting data while it's being processed. Computing on encrypted data, things like MPC and FHE, which will not really be discussed in this week, but we'll focus mostly on the basic protections of communications and stored data. And so breakthrough happened in 1975. These two characters, Marty Hellman and Whitfield Diffie, actually made the observation that to encrypt, you can also use a public key. And then for decryption, you need a private key. And this makes it possible to have secure communications over open channels without first having to agree on a secret key somehow. So this, of course, has made evolution possible, although it's interesting to point out that when cryptography was invented, or public key cryptography was invented in 1975, it could not be implemented because there is an interesting series of papers by Professor Ron Rivest, the inventor of RSA, in the 80s, where he tried to build an RSA chip with 512 bits, and he kind of failed. He never managed to get a working chip, let alone to do this in software that was completely unthinkable because computers were way too slow. And another element of an aspect, introduction of innovation by Diffie and Hellman is digital signatures. So kind of a very naive story is you can swap the roles of keys and you can transform information with a private key, and then anybody can check with a public key. And both things are now part of our infrastructure today. If you visit the website, you use public key cryptography, a secure channel to send your credit card number or to hide what you're sending to the website, like your medical data. And on the other hand, all code updates are being signed, and also more and more people are signing now also documents and contracts. So, as I said, until about 100 years ago, cryptography was expensive and slow, was reserved for kings, generals, and diplomats. There were some hand ciphers, there were also some mechanical ciphers, because the real breakthrough happened in 1920 when there was wireless communication, and that meant that there was much more communication to be protected, because now the admiral could control his fleet all over the world, and also businessmen and businesswomen could do transactions remotely by wireless. And so this made an enormous impact because, of course, wireless is easier to intercept than a letter that you give to somebody or something on a wire. And so that gave rise to a first crypto boom in the 1920s, where machines like Enigma and Boris Hagelin made his series of machines. She gave the first boom, and then in the 1950s and 60s, these machines became electronical. So the first high-level machines in the 1920s were mechanical. Then things like Enigma were electromechanical, and then people switched in the 50s and 60s to electronic machines. And then the first commercial application of cryptography happened in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. IBM started working on this, and the banks shifted to mainframes and started doing financial processing and also financial transactions electronically. So there you got the first industrial use of cryptography, so outside government use. So then Diffie and Hellman published their paper, which, as I said before, technology could not be implemented. It was very cool. It drew quite some academic research, but technology could not be implemented. So then we saw the first larger scale adoption. Also the banks got like ATM machines. They got more access to payments to companies, and also telecommunication companies started selling secure communication services. That happened in the 80s. And then in 1990, a very big change happened. Well, it's not an exact year, but around that time, so 35 years ago, computers became fast enough, cryptography could move to software. So it was now suddenly possible to do encryption in software fast enough. People also made new algorithms for software, but also algorithms like RSA, you could finally implement RSA in software. And there was a company, RSA, selling this, but there was also the PGP software, which was made available for free. So that was a very big breakthrough. And then, of course, the internet became a mass product with the invention of the World Wide Web, early 90s. And then we saw large-scale adoption. At least standards were made. SSL was created in 94, 95. But the number of servers having SSL services was very limited, to something like in 2013, after 20 years, about 10 to 12 million. So it was still not widely adopted. But then something important happened, the Snowden documents. So Snowden leaked how much mass surveillance was being done by the Five Eyes, in particular by US and UK. And that led in a very big boost in cryptography. Let's Encrypt got created, for example. And so today, actually, there is more than 600 million servers on the web that have TLS protection. So more or less, it's so easy now that almost everybody now has secure web. We also saw messaging being adopted. And again, security was driven by the fact that first it was usable, then new protocols were invented more secure. It was also driven by the Snowden revelations. We actually should do this. We should stop sending these postcards. And so this was how the pressure increased to end-to-end encrypt things like WhatsApp and iMessage. And then also something else happened, of course, around that time, which is the cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin was 2008, 2009, and the takeoff about 12 years ago. And so the next big thing that will happen, so now cryptography is a mass product, is going to be the post-quantum cryptography migration. That's more or less starting now, although it's a long-term process, as we will see. And that's something which will, I think, keep cryptographers busy for the next 10 years. In addition to, of course, computing unencrypted data, that's another development that's happening more or less in parallel and orthogonal, because luckily, a lot of the schemes that, for example, are used in MPC are post-quantum resistant by itself. So there we may not have to redo stuff. It's actually an amazing success, because when I started in cryptography in 1987, I don't think there were many cryptographic devices out there. Of course, in governments, there were some, but cryptographic devices cost something like 10,000 euros, something like this. So it was very expensive. You need two. So I was lucky that I could work for Swift. They were very close by at KU Leuven, and they had lots of money, and they designed their own cryptography. And they had the money to install cryptography devices. So I started working with them, and I gave them advice on cryptography. But again, Swift had probably a few thousand devices. And probably in the whole world, there were less than a few 100,000 cryptographic devices in 1987. So today, my estimate is there is something like 80 or 90 billion cryptographic devices, or libraries or applications. So if you count very broadly, I think you may get close to 100 billion, which is really amazing, going from a few 100,000 to 80 to 90 billion in something like 40 years. Most of it is not there to protect Alice and Bob. forget about this. Alice and Bob don't have money, they don't pay for it. Cryptography is used to protect companies and governments against users. That's what it's used for. So a good example is your bank card. There's something like 26 billion bank cards out there. When you can argue it protects your money, but the real thing a bank card does, it protects the bank against you. It prevents you from spending more money than you have. So it's a small spy that you're very happy with in your pocket, and every time you try to pay something, it watches what you're doing, and if you want to pay too much, it says no. So more or less, it's there to protect the interest of the banks. You also have the update system. Whatever you count, there's something like probably 10 billion devices on the internet, like phones, tablets, laptops. And then there is now another 20 billion, maybe I could add the IoT devices that not all have security, but many do. And they have code updates. I guess you all know about this, that your device is being updated. I get security updates once every couple of months, so you may get once a month a security update, and then all your apps are being updated as well, the whole day, nothing else happening and apps being updated. It's a major cryptographic infrastructure using signatures, but you don't have control as a user. If the owner of the app makes an update, maybe there is some new features you like, maybe there is some new features you hate, but you can't choose. The owner of the app is in control and tells you, here is a new version, please install it. And sometimes even if you don't want to install it, they take away the old version. So it's also a form of control by outside parties. You have access cards. We now, of course, have Netflix and the likes, but there was a very important market, and it still exists in some markets, of content access for games and movies, and also their cryptography, of course, is being used. Also, Netflix uses cryptography to make sure that you can decrypt the videos you watch and post them on the internet, more or less. So again, this is not to help the user, because in fact, for Netflix, you're the enemy. You're their customer, but also their enemy, because their threat model is that you would take the video and put it online for free. Then there is identity cards and passports, also have cryptography. Access devices and so on. So that's all kind of very small. The big scale is what's in the consumer stuff. There is some cryptography to protect Alice and Bob, maybe in your phones. Already amazingly, in these mobile phones, since the late 80s, there is cryptography. Because Prince Charles said some things to Camilla, which he shouldn't have said probably because they were not married at the time. And this was intercepted by a journalist, and this gave the drive to actually add encryption to GSM, to the second generation phone systems. Something like 9 billion devices out there, but I guess you all read the warnings of the US government. So the US government told their own employees, if you have an important phone call, don't use your phone. Or the functions on your phone, because the encryption on your phone is only from your phone to the base station or base station controller. And in the fixed network, everything is in free. And why is this? It's because governments insisted that they should be able to do wiretapping for law enforcement. But of course, what cryptographers keep saying is, if you don't have end-to-end encryption, but you kind of decrypt through the network, and then in the network you decrypt, then you'll get hackers in your network listening to all your conversations. And guess what? Last October, Cell Typhoon was released. A large country in the east somewhere apparently has been penetrating the phone systems of many nations and been eavesdropping on conversations. And it was so bad that the US government even said to everybody working for the government, stop using your phone for conversations. Switch to WhatsApp or Signal or something else if you want secure calls. Go to end-to-end encryption. So the web ecosystem I mentioned already. So there is about like 11 billion devices, and then another 10, maybe 15 billion on the IoT. And many of them use TLS. And then on the server side, there is something like, well, this is 50 million. I think we now should update this. This is probably an old version of the slide, but got in there is like now more like 500 million. So we now have, thanks to Let's Encrypt, we have 500 million servers offering services, and to which there is something like 11 billion, and maybe this is more like 20 billion, 30 billion devices connecting. I could give a whole lecture about the web ecosystem. There is many problems with it. Of course, it does work. It does offer you secure communications, but there is also many ways to intercept it, especially to, for example, in the financial sector, it's seen as common standard that you should intercept all TLS connections because you want to watch what your traders are doing, or you want to prevent your employees from watching or being on Facebook while they're at work and so on. So there is many attacks by nation states, but also by corporations to intercept the web. And they don't break the cryptography, they actually break the public key infrastructure, and they break the signatures of the servers. I guess the most secure encryption is probably what we have on our devices. Our phones are probably more secure than our laptops even, because they're better controlled. And there we have quite good device encryption. We have messaging, which is also large scale. But I guess you all know that in messaging, there is backups in the cloud, which are not properly protected. And if, for example, Apple does properly protect it, and the UK government comes in and says we want access to the data, so there is still a fight happening there. The paranoid among us, of course, use Signal, but Signal is still like hundreds of millions, it's not billions. So we still don't have billions of products that give secure end-to-end encryption. That's more or less the message. So, but let's just zoom in now, not but who's being protected, but like what are the public key deployments? Because I guess coming to this course, you realize that the problem is mostly with public key. So here I have some numbers like IoT is in the order of something like 20 billion. Browsers is 10 billion. Updates is also something like this. Then you have the messaging applications. They are again in the billions. Content protection. Bank cards, at least the credit cards are public key. So most debit cards are still national based, or at least go online to issuer, as we say this, which means that there is no public key cryptography. Maybe in the back end, but not on your card. So only the credit cards have public key cryptography. This is the famous EMV specs. And then there's game consoles, identity cards, and so on. So it's about 2/3 of the applications use public key cryptography, mostly for signing, code updates, and then encryption like messaging and TLS, where you have about 600 million servers connecting to 10 billion user devices and a similar number of IoT devices. So I'm quite sure that the people from industry will talk about this more on Thursday, but if you've never been in really developing an application, then you don't understand how difficult it is to upgrade stuff. And so the vision you have is that, oh, I will do an app. For example, I did an app, Corona Alert, so a contact tracing app in 2020. And you think naively, so we got in Belgium 2 million users. The application, we had connecting applications somehow to a back office in Europe. In total, there were about 100 million applications. So as a naive person, I thought that, you have an app and you improve it, so you make a new version available. And so within a week, everybody has a new version. I'll forget about that. There is always, every time you make a new version, there is some people who don't upgrade. And there is actually many people who don't configure automatic updates in their devices. Although it's easy, many people don't do this. And the more your system is deployed, and of course, the more it's connected to other stuff, the harder it is to do updates. And there is very nice studies on TLS, which is one of the largest ecosystems. Again, 600 million servers, something like 20 billion devices. What you see here is lots of information about the versions of TLS. So, for example, what do you see here in pink? So the best version is TLS 1.3. What you see here, so this time TLS 1.3 was actually created in 2018, okay? As a consequence of the Snowden documents. People said we really have to clean up TLS because the Snowden documents showed how governments penetrate TLS and use all the weaknesses and complexities of TLS. And so they said in 2 years we'll make a new version. In the end, it took something like almost 5 years. And here you see the adoption of TLS 1.3. So it goes very fast, but it goes till last year. So we're still not at 80% of adoption of TLS as the best version. Right? It means that there is still about 30% of versions that don't speak TLS 1.3 of devices and servers out there. And this is not new because here you see the same development for TLS 1.0 and 1.1. In fact, there it was even slower because many flaws were discovered in TLS early 2000s, and then new versions were made 1.1 in 2006, 1.2 in 2008, I believe. But in fact, by 2010, there was no adoption of those versions. Everybody still stuck to TLS 1.0, which was more or less SSL 3.0 with some small changes. And then there was gradual push, and I guess the Snowden documents helped. But again, you see, if you look at the time scale, it took about 10 years for most devices to get upgraded. And then another example is SSL 3.0. This is the version that was, I think, 96 or so. It was kind of the de facto standard for a long time. And then finally, there was the Poodle attack. So if you ever have an attack, give it a cool name. Because if you don't give your attack a cool name, nobody will pay attention. Okay? If you call your attack the cross-public key validation attack or something, nobody cares. But if you call your attack Beast or Poodle or Crime, then people pay attention. But even then, people called their attack Poodle, and there was quite of a scare. So quite people got rid of TLS or the SSL 3.0. But again, if you look at the curve here, it's a very slow curve going down. And the last is still servers offering SSL 3.0. So this is something to make the bridge a gap between the academic world and the real world. So we think naively as academics that there is a problem, you fix it, and make a new version available. And yes, some people have to test stuff, but like within 6 months to a year, everybody's there. No, every migration, even if it's low cost, even if it improves everything, takes at least 10 years of a large ecosystem. That's a very important lesson to learn. And we've seen the same thing with MD5. In 93, there was the first attack on MD5. In 95, RSA said stop using MD5. In 2004, Microsoft still had 800 users of MD5 in Windows when MD5 was broken by Professor Wang. The same thing with SHA-1. Professor Wang broke SHA-1 in 2004. And the migration away from SHA-1 only happened in 2017 when there was a real collision. Because some people don't only believe something when they see it, they don't believe a paper. Same thing with the DES migration. Already Diffie wrote a paper with Hellman saying the DES key is too short. In 93, Mike Wiener published a paper with a design. And in 96, that the machine was built, or 97. And by 2006, not all the banks had migrated away from single DES. So it's important to remember that. Okay, then the quantum threat. So the concept of quantum computers, it dates back to the early 80s. And then Shor showed his factoring algorithm in 94. The first time something was factored, although you can argue how it was really implementing Shor's algorithm or whether the structure of 15 was used and so on. But at least a 7-bit computer was built in 2001. Was a student of KU Leuven, went to do his PhD in Stanford, and is now professor in Delft. And then the academics started responding, in fact, already to Peter Shor's algorithm, because in the late 90s, there were the first papers, I would say, interested in post-quantum cryptography. But the first conference actually happened in Leuven in 2006 as part of the eCrypt project. It was the first PQC conference. And now, as we will see, companies give cool names to their computers. So the world is changing a lot again. So normally people give the credit to Feynman, who had this idea of building a computer that would behave like physics to actually simulate physical processes. Because physics is governed by very complex laws. And it turns out that solving those on a classical computer is very hard. And so Feynman had the idea of building a quantum computer that would solve quantum problems to improve our understanding of quantum physics, but also of chemistry and so on. That was the main driver. Also, Manin, a Russian scientist, suggested that these things would be possible. And so the ideas, without going too much into detail, is that you would get kind of exponential parallelism by using principles like entanglement and superposition. And I'm quite sure you'll get more about this in the lecture later today, so I will not go too much into the details. What we do know is that already 11 years ago, the NSA had spent $85 million on quantum computers. So this is a leak from the Snowden documents, so it really shows that there was interest in building these things for factoring. And then there was also a report from McKinsey that China spent 14 billion on quantum technologies, but then it turns out they didn't know it was 14 or 4, small error, but okay, a lot of money as well. And the US only spent 3.7 billion. So Shor published his famous paper, and more or less, without going into details, Shor was able to prove that factoring can be reduced to period finding, and period finding you can do with the fast Fourier transform. And this is like the bread and butter of all signal processing. This is a n log n algorithm, a very efficient algorithm that we use every day in filters and in processing of speech and images and so on. So it's a very efficient algorithm. And so Shor showed that if you have such an algorithm on a quantum computer, on a large enough quantum computer, you can actually factor, for which we don't have any good algorithm on a classical computer. So the best algorithms are sub-exponential. And as you know, the record is something like 800 bits. Probably the NSA can do 1024 bits today, maybe a bit more even. But there is no good classical algorithms, while on a quantum computer, you would be able to do this quite efficiently. And so it can be done efficiently, which means that more or less you need a couple of thousand qubits, more or less, to break RSA 2048. This is what is still the standard today. For example, in the credit card system, in the passports that don't lose elliptic curve use RSA 2048, the Belgian identity card, the Estonian identity card. So this kind of de facto standard is RSA 2048. Although there is already a pressure for a while to go to larger keys, it's kind of expensive and most people don't want to do this. Now, the problem of quantum computers is that they're based on physics and there is noise. So it's kind of very hard to create stable qubits. You also have to avoid interference with the environment. And so a large effort in building these computers is to do error correction. This is really where the problem is, and it's also where lots of research goes. So it's actually not about counting qubits, which is what the journalists and the outside world tries to do. The real problem is correct the errors and also keep the things stable for long enough. But there were some experts who made estimates. And so the estimate until recently was that to actually get logical qubits which are reliable enough and to get 4,096 of those, you would need about 20 million physical qubits. That was the estimate, but then there was quite some noise last month because a researcher from Google actually published an improved paper. So he revisited his numbers, he looked at the improvements in error correction, and his estimate was that it's actually less than 1 million qubits. So this made quite some noise. It was not unexpected if you look at the predicted progress, but still it's a very interesting paper that shows that there will be improvements from the side of bigger quantum computers, but also improvement from the side of better algorithms and a better way of realizing logical qubits from noisy physical qubits. Then there is another result from Grover 2 years after Peter Shor that actually says that, well, you can search a space with a computer in a square root time of the size of the space, which has implications on cryptography, but in particular also on symmetric cryptography. So more or less, the summary of Grover is that a 128-bit AES key is only a 64-bit key. And if you want 128-bit security, you should have a 256-bit key. Now, there is good news because when AES was created, people knew about Grover's algorithm. So the AES standard already has a 256-bit option. But people like Sam Jacques, who know much more about this stuff than me, actually, he gave a very nice talk at Chess last year in which he shows that this algorithm is completely impractical and will not be practical for the next many decades. Because it needs a huge quantum computer with something like 2 to 70 gates, and there is like no way that it can be ever realized, at least not in the next decades. So this is kind of very frustrating for industry because dealing with Grover's algorithm is easy. You just double your key length. You can do it, but then the academics say it's not needed. So, but in industry, of course, it feels good. You can do this because your migration is easy. It's an easy migration, not much problems. But then actually, you shouldn't bother. But OK, if you want to do it, you feel good about it. Go ahead. We're not going to stop you. And AES 256 has 14 rounds, so it has not much slower, only 40% slower. And actually, it gives you a good feeling, and you can advertise quantum resistant. But actually, it's a waste of time. The real problem is not Grover, is Shor. And of course, I mentioned factoring, but it would also break discrete log over ZP and also break elliptic curves. So more or less all number theory-based cryptography we have today. Or not the isogenies, but. This is a slide that I borrowed from Leuven from 2001. So just to show you, because many people show you graphs and they say we had 7 qubits in 2001 and we have about 1,000 qubits now, and they show this graph. But in fact, here you see that in the 90s, already people were struggling a lot to go from 1 qubit to 7 qubits and go from 1 gate to a few gates. So more or less, it's important to see the history that people did not start developing this right after Feynman's paper, but actually a few years after people, and this is all top labs. So this shows that a lot of people are working on it, but also that the progress is not as slow. So people who want to argue it's going to come very fast, they show you graphs which cuts out, for example, this period. So there was actually, it took 10 years to even get a first qubit stable and interconnected and working. It took like a decade. Here is this famous computer. So it's a 7-qubit computer built by IBM. It uses a molecule with 7 degrees of freedom, and it took 2 PhD students 4 years to program it and then to show that 15 is 5 times 3. So now the world has changed a lot. So fast forward 24 years later, companies are spending huge budgets, I think much more than the 85 million mentioned by the NSA. And so if you spend huge budgets, then you have to justify this to your management, so you need some marketing people involved. And marketing people are dangerous because, you know, well, they're helpful, but they can also be dangerous. Because, of course, once you start spending as a company tens or hundreds of millions, then your CEO and your board asks once a year, and what have you achieved? So then marketing comes in and shows what you have achieved. That actually the board and the CEO are happy. So you have to now, you have to understand that there is dozens of companies spending lots of money, and they all have to make breakthroughs every year, because, or at least every few years, otherwise the program will be cut, okay? Plus, none of these companies will say it's going to take at least 15 years, because then the CEO may cut their budget as well. So you have all these people, and in the academic world we have the same problem, of course. You want to get from your government hundreds of millions, or from the European Commission, and you cannot say, it may take 20 years, because then they will cut your budget. So you always have to announce things, and you always have to announce breakthroughs. Every development is a breakthrough. So, and then of course this wave of panic creates, because another breakthrough in quantum computing. And I'm not saying they don't do great work, and they are making progress, but on the other hand, be careful that the marketing people have been involved. And so marketing people already came up with one thing is, you should give your quantum computer a name. A very big mistake of these guys in Stanford. The computer, it had no name. They would have been more famous if, you probably never heard of them, right? Lieven van der Sijpen, you never heard of him. Why? He didn't understand you should make a cool name for your computer. It's too late now. So, but the guys in marketing know this. So Microsoft has Majorana, these topological qubits, very different principles. Only 8 qubits. Amazon has Ocelot. Google has Willow. Chinese Academy of Science and Quantum Tech have Tianyan. IBM has Condor. And then Atom has... these have a cool name for their company. Well, cool. They have a name for their company you can remember. Now, so you would think that this is the status of progress. Of course, it's not. Because, in fact, probably the most powerful one may be this one. Because it's not only qubits, it's also about error correction, about noise, about stability. So qubits are only one aspect of several dimensions. But of course, the marketing people don't care, right? They'll show you a cool picture and cool name, and they say mine is bigger. Or Microsoft, of course, they can't say that, so they'll say, well, but our system, once we can build it larger, it actually will scale much better, and so on. So marketing will tell you what is happening here. So this happens when you get IBM marketing in action. So IBM actually makes a very detailed roadmap. Don't try to read this. But it's interesting if you download them and store them and compare them, and you see how they keep shifting their roadmap. So for example, the latest ploy is that they now have a development roadmap and an innovation roadmap. And if you want to understand this, Mike Osborne will be here and he can maybe explain it. I can't, but he can probably explain it to you. If you have questions, you ask him about the IBM roadmap. But it's interesting because it's very detailed. And it clearly shows IBM is very active. So where are they now? They're somewhere here. So for this year, they have announced Flamingo and Heron for last year. So they have like 5,000 qubits, but we haven't seen those systems yet. But again, ask Mike Osborne on Thursday. Google is much simpler. Google says just, here is the following 6 stages. We have beyond classical, 54 qubits. They managed in 2023 to do quantum error correction and have 1 qubit that they could correct. So if you look at this, it's very interesting. So then you wonder what happened in 2001, because they did calculations with the qubit and there was no error correction. I guess ask the experts, but I guess also 2001 some marketing was happening, because it seems that the first time a qubit could be corrected was 2023. So now they want to make it long-lived, because in fact this lived only very short, not enough to do much useful with it. So then might want to make it long-lived and then make a gate. So you see, they even are very honest, they don't have a working gate, so all the others don't have it either. But they keep announcing things, thousands of qubits, but they have no gate that works. And then of course scale up and large error correction. And so this is, I think, again, you can ask Christiana, they're probably very close to this. So building a long-lived single qubit. But then, of course, it's clear that none of those things are going to happen in 1 year. And so this is probably still a while away. If you want to find out more, there will be a lecture later today, but if you want to like to read stuff, and it's a very long report by BSI, they actually look at all technologies and how they try to look at all these technologies, which are very different, and try to look at where are they, what are the principles behind it, what about error correction, what about stability, so what about all the properties. They try to make a very thorough and detailed analysis of the state of the art. And the report is freely available, and I assume they update it regularly. So you get the slides where you can have the link. You don't try to write down this link, it's impossible. It has many long German words, but you'll get the slides and you can click on them. So here is a summary of their report. So more or less they say that ion traps and 2-day transmons are the most advanced because they have the error correction already. And topological qubits are just in the very basic functions. That doesn't mean that this is completely unworkable. It's a very different principle, and maybe at some stage it can make progress. Of course, if you look at scalability, you would like to have silicon, because that we know how to scale. I mean, the modern transistor is so small that in your phone or your laptop, you have tens of billions of transistors in one chip. So that's technology we know how to scale. But there is a whole range of technologies which leads me to the conclusion, I'm not an expert, like it's very dangerous to bet this is all going to fail. I don't think any one of this will build this 1 million qubits next year or in 5 years, but on the other hand, betting that it's not going to work is getting more dangerous, I would think. So this is another graph by Sam Jacques, which he updates regularly. He hasn't done 2025 edition yet. So what you have here is number of qubits, and on the y-axis, the error rate. It's still not all the dimensions, but I guess gives you an idea. So more or less, this gray zone here, this is all the efforts starting in 1990 till now. So this is 35 years of effort to go from this corner here to this area here. So more advanced things are things like IBM, QEra, Google, IonQ, and so on. So what you have in blue is surface codes works, which means certain error correction codes that you can actually work. And so Google and several other players have managed to do this. What you see here in the green area is where you can do useful quantum chemistry, which could be very valuable because you could invent new medicine or new molecules or new materials. So we always think about these computers as breaking cryptography, but in fact, this is not a very big business. It's a very big business for some governments, and probably governments are willing to pay companies lots of money to get those computers, so they can probably recoup their investment. But it will still only be a market of billions, right? The global IT market is of course something like $10,000 billion. So if you really want to make money, you have to invest, you have to find new medicines or new materials. That's also multiple trillion-dollar markets. Okay, so this is where the money will be made, not in breaking cryptography. We're just a side effect of this business. But so this is where we are, and if you want to break cryptography, this is the RSA curves, and I guess this has not taken into account the latest developments. So this improvement by a factor of 20, but of course this is a log scale, so a factor of 20 will move it more or less a little bit to the left. But so these curves are also not fixed, so they may move a bit, but you still see that the gap is quite big. And I'm curious to see the next version of this graph when it will come out. So he also publishes regular updates of this. You can do something else, like Michele Mosca. He goes around and he asks experts what they think. That's another form of science. You have to be aware that these experts are biased. Many of them get big grants to build those computers. So they're not going to say it's not going to work ever, right? So, but what they say here is, so he asked the question, so do you think that this, what we call cryptographically relevant quantum computer will be available in the next X years? So this is the one that would break ISA 2048. And so as you see, about half the expert believes it will take 15 years. That's what you can get from this graph. There's some very optimistic experts. 1 in 10 believes it can be done in 5 years. And then there's some pessimistic people who believe that it will take at least 30 years. So more or less what you would expect. But then taking into account the bias, you probably have to add a few more years to be sure. But at least it shows you even the experts don't know. And I guess 15 years does not seem to be unrealistic expectation. Then you can ask Adi Shamir, and he believes it will never work. There is actually several famous people, also people with good physics knowledge, who claim that it's all going to hit a limit and it will never actually work. I think it's a very dangerous bet, but just be aware of this, that opinions are different. I think more or less the view is that even if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter anymore, because the governments have now decided it will work, and the governments will impose on everybody who sells stuff to them that they have to deal with it, and the financial sector regulators will tell everybody to deal with this. So whatever you believe is no longer relevant because some important people have decided that we can't take the risk anymore. That's more or less where we are today. Okay, then we'll do some math, the only math of my talk, which is Mosca's equation. I guess you're all familiar with this. So you make your guess of Q. The Q day, as people call it, if you really want to give a cool talk, you call it Q day. So how many years until Q day? This is the first cryptographically relevant quantum computer, so the famous RSA 2048. How long it takes to switch, you make your estimate. And remember, if you have maybe if you have a gaming app or so and you have new features, you can convince all your users to switch in 3 months. But any large-scale system, I think 10 years is a safe bet. To give you an idea, EMV made a plan in 2008 to switch from RSA to elliptic curve. And then they started talking to people about this and working on this. And their timeline to be done was 2030. Okay, so the estimate was from the concept to do this, to get everybody migrated, would take 22 years. And then by 2016, they abandoned the project. In fact, there is no plan to switch because they figure out that by the time they will be done, they would need post-quantum anyway. And of course, the problem is not cards, because most people get a new credit card every 2 or 3 years. The problem is the terminals. There is something like 100 million terminals, and you have to upgrade them all. Plus all the back offices, the acquirers, and all these large companies that have legacy infrastructure with HSMs and so on, and updating this takes 22 years. And then the other aspect, if you list as encryption, it doesn't apply to signatures, is how long should your data be confidential? And of course, if your business confidentiality, I mean, I signed quite some NDAs, it always says 5 years, but I assume there is also some rules that it's 10 years. But medical data should be your lifetime, so for some people this can be 80 years. For DNA, maybe it should also be it should actually be forever, because it affects your children and your grandchildren. But of course, if you're a government and you do illegal stuff, then 50 years is not even enough, because for governments, very often 50 years is the rule. And then if you do illegal stuff, again, it wants to be, I mean, if you illegally killed somebody, then you don't want this to be leaked for the rest of your life, hopefully. So this shows that this number has a very large variance. But it also shows that if you work for government, then you probably have y equal to 50 or maybe even 100. And then Mosca's equation says you should start switching in the year 2025 plus q minus x minus y. It's not rocket science, you can all do this, okay? And then there is, of course, the other element is the procrastination. This is what Jaime keeps adding to this. So if you go to a company and you convince them, even then it will take X years to convince the company actually to start moving. even if the CEO is convinced and so on. You have the budget cycles and whatever, so there is another like 2 to 3 years that you get always before you get some large organization moving or an ecosystem moving. Before everybody's convinced, you lose another. Even if the equation says this, before everybody has understood this equation in a large ecosystem, it also takes 3 years or so. But this is even ignored here. So if you take U is 15, which is what some experts say is realistic, and X is 5, so you're quite fast, and Y is 10, then you should switch today. So more or less, where are we in practice? If you look at these numbers, so the algorithms were done in 2000 by 24. The standards have started appearing now. You still have to implement them, then you have to validate, certification, and then you have to deploy. So I think if you can get something deployed by 2030 in a large system, it's very good. As we will see, some things have already been deployed, but if you have a system, a legacy system, getting something done in the next 5 years, I would say, fantastic, well done, great job. And then you have just enough protection for this computer to arrive by 2040. You have 10 years protection. Of course, if your Y is 50, well, you're way too late already. And your opponents in 2040 will read everything that are your state secrets that you hope to keep secret for tens of years. So this also shows why, for example, the NSA is much more panicky than the rest of the world, because I guess they do more illegal things than some other things, so they're actually much more worried about this. Okay, for signatures, you actually can re-sign all your documents or updates the day before the Q day, and so you actually have a bit more margin. So this lecture is about post-quantum cryptography. I can be very fast because you get many more details. This is just a high-level overview. So what you do in cryptography, if you're in problem, it's like with DES and with MD5 and SHA-1, you organize a competition. It's like the Olympic Games for cryptographers. And so you ask experts, give us an algorithm that will be secure for 50 years or more. And so 82 algorithms were submitted. I think about a third was broken within a few years. So don't trust cryptographers. That's an important message to learn from this. And so in the end, 4 were selected after a long process between 2016 and 2026. And as we will see, the process is still ongoing. It's like a never-ending competition, this one. What was remained is actually 3 lattice-based schemes. No code-based scheme, but now a new one has been picked up in an extension of the competition. Multivariate is still in very dire place, 0. Hash-based signatures, there is 1, but there were 2 others before. And then other that didn't fare very well. But there is now quite some interest in isogenies. I guess this has emerged as kind of the new area. But I think there is interesting lessons to be learned. So if you ask experts, they will make many mistakes. And here's an example of some stuff done in COSIC. So people really believed in the COSIC algorithm, and then it was broken over a weekend by Wouter and Thomas. The good news is that this algorithm actually has given rise to new methods to use isogenies. So it kind of was very bad for COSIC, but actually it was not the end of the field, but actually the beginning of a new field, which was interesting. And then Bart Preneel actually broke Rainbow in a weekend on a laptop. And he did it again this year. He broke S-Nova in a weekend on a laptop. So this is his way of spending weekends, is killing algorithm in this competition. Competition of 2016, then actually IETF already standardized XMSS and LMS. These are hash-based signatures. Andreas will talk about them. They're actually state-based, which has many implementation risks, but it makes them more efficient. Then NIST selected MLChem, MLDSA, and Sphinx Plus, which they also gave an unreadable name. So these names are really terrible. Can we all agree that these names are terrible? MLChem and MLDSA. At least they were called Kyber and Dilithium, but now terrible names. France and Germany like PhotoChem, which is an unstructured lattice, and the Germans still like Macalise. And in ISO, I guess Iceland will tell you more about the battles there. Then recently HQC was standardized. Falcon was also selected, but then they didn't figure out very well how it worked. And then it took another year to make the standard, and now the draft is out, I guess, and it will be there as well. And then there is still an ongoing competition for more signature schemes that will end whenever. And then Japan, China, and Korea are doing their own stuff. So it's going to be a very interesting world. This is guaranteed job certainty for cryptographers because we used to have RSA for a while, then ECC, and that was it. And you know, the most difficult thing you had to deal with was ECDSA versus EDDSA, but now there's going to be a whole zoo of stuff out there. So this is a job opportunities for cryptographers, fantastic. Okay, so what is the executive summary of this? Is that actually the algorithms are not slower. People always thought that post-quantum cryptography will be slower. In fact, sometimes it's the same speed, sometimes it's slightly faster even, sometimes it's a bit slower, but the speed is not the concern. The problem is for encryption, the size of keys plus ciphertext goes times 3 to 2 times 50. And this is, again, computers get faster and networks get faster. So in some sense, you know, in the 90s, people also surfed the web, and the internet connection was something like 100 kilobits. So we actually have fast enough network speeds, but of course it's not as easy because there is all these low-end applications, like for example for your payments, when you hold your payment card against a terminal, this is hundreds of milliseconds, and there already you can't do any public key cryptography, not even ECC is too slow for that. So there it will be completely impossible. Then the other problem is that on the internet, you send many small packets to set up things. And if you put huge keys in there or huge ciphertext, then there will be many more packets and fragmentation. And in fact, it will give a noticeable delay. So it turns out that if you take an existing protocol and you take a library, post-quantum cryptography, not even side-channel secure, but like a basic library with decent optimization, you plug it in there, your system may crash. Some things work fine, no problem, but some others will crash because there's too much fragmentation, retransmission, whatever, things break down, so you have to rethink and re-engineer stuff. And this is very painful because there is 60 billion devices and libraries out there. It's going to be very hard. Signatures, there it's even worse. The sum of public key and signatures is what you have in a certificate, but very often you have to send both. And then certificate chains. So if you today do web, for example, you have a root CA, intermediate CA, and then a server certificate, and then a signature on for the protocol. So you have, like, in the worst case, to send 4 signatures and all these public keys. And it's already big today. It's kilobytes today. But if it becomes tens of kilobytes, a lot of stuff will break. So we'll have to probably come up with a new infrastructure how to deal with this. So signing is typically faster and verification is comparable to faster. So there the performance is again not the problem, but the problem is the size of stuff. This is a graph I borrowed from the NIST slides. So this is public key. What you see here in the x-axis is the public key size in bytes. In the y-axis is ciphertext size. And so ECC sits somewhere here, RSA sits somewhere here, so like a few hundred bytes. And the sum is still less than a kilobyte. And so here is the lattice-based schemes. For example, here is Macaleese, very short ciphertext, but huge public keys. And then the unstructured lattices like PhotoChem, they're also in this range here. So this is what actually will create a nightmare for many people, or you can also say a job opportunity for cryptographers for the next 10 years. Because you have to kind of redesign your protocols to deal with this. I tried to use the signature zoo to make kind of a summary, an executive summary again. I don't go too much into detail. What you see here is a lot of signature schemes, and they're not all of them. I grouped them in categories, like multivariate got one line only. So look at security. So if you have a red cross here, then it means you're not post-quantum secure. Then the size of public key plus signature, and then the time to sign and verify. So I try to reduce information to as little as possible. So what you see is that our current schemes are actually quite fast and quite short signatures, but then they're not secure. Then you have MLDSA, the sum of public key and signature is 273. If you come from 96, this is a huge factor. But the speed is quite good. And so now you see Falcon. Why is Falcon so popular? Because it brings the 2700 down to 1500. And I say, is that so important? Well, apparently it is. It may make a difference that it will not make certain things break down. If you have the stateful hash-based signatures, they also have quite short. They're 1100 bytes, but then they have some security issues. And they're very difficult for cloud environments where you have replication and kind of this copies that being regenerated of stuff all the time automatically. If you do this with a hash-based signature that is stateful, then you create a nightmare. So it's only for some applications that it works. So here is then a kind of overview of some of the candidates that are still in the ongoing competition, and you will probably hear more about those. So very interesting is, for example, SkiSign, isogeny-based. It actually is quite efficient by size, so it's like less than RSA and only 2 times more than elliptic curve, but then it's about 9,000 times slower than what you expect. So again, for some applications, this is not acceptable, and this will be a problem. So the best multivariate was S-Nova. It went down to 1200 for the sum of public key and signatures. It turns out it was broken in a weekend on a laptop, so we'll have to go to the next best one and hope that that doesn't get broken in the next weekend on a laptop that White Bolens has. So it's a bit of a concern there. But so it now shows you, or at least now you know what the motivation was for this extra round of signatures competition, because NIST is kind of happy with this, but this is not good enough for many applications. So they wanted to reduce, in particular, the sum of public key and signature size. And if we look at it now, it doesn't seem that they've succeeded. Maybe for SkiSign, but then, of course, this is not acceptable. So I think this is the bad news. Is that for encryption, we got pretty close. For signatures, we actually are in trouble. Well, we can, of course, redefine protocols and rethink things and do things differently, but we cannot just plug and play, put in the library, and hope it's going to work. Okay. So this is more or less summarized here. Large key ciphertext and signatures. Of course, if you're more robust, and some people still believe that Macaleese is very robust. It's an old scheme. And there was this paper at Eurocrypt about distinguishing the matrix from a random matrix. Some people think the impact is not so big. But also FrodoChem, which uses a lattice with less structure than MLChem. But of course, you pay a price. If you want to remove structure, you pay a price in performance. So most of the schemes are lattice-based. You'll hear quite a bit about lattices. They have good performance. So the question is this structure a risk or not? Can it be exploited? And there is interesting challenges you will hear about. For example, decryption failures are a new thing for cryptography. This is not something that we had to deal with in the past. Falcon has floating point arithmetic. Again, very interesting to deal with. You have to do noise sampling because you have to add noise. So you need to make sure that this all happens securely. So there is quite some interesting things. And there is also for side channel resistance, you have this Fujisaka Okamoto mode, where when you decrypt, you have to re-encrypt and check that you get the right result to verify your decryption, which means you have to make also the encryption side channel resistant, which actually kind of increases the cost in embedded environment. So there is kind of lots of things are changing, things that took us a long time to figure out. You cannot just transport to the post-quantum world. And you'll hear more about those things, I'm sure, later. So Cloudflare process very interesting statistics about what's happening. So this is, for example, numbers on the slowdown in TLS. And so the slowdown does not happen because the schemes are necessarily slower, but the slowdown happens because the packets get bigger. And so you have in the beginning of TLS, you have some exchanges, and if you have sent more bytes, it slows things down. And so what they did here, they added dummy data, and then they showed you how much things got slower. So you see it's actually not so bad. So for example, here, the worst case, it was only 3 times slower. It doesn't look so bad. And there is 2 perspectives on this, right? You can also say computers get still faster by a factor of 2 every 18 months or every 2 years, maybe. So what is this factor 2 that you're whining about? On the other hand, of course, if somebody has invested billions of infrastructure, and then you tell them, well, it's not enough, you're going to have to add another billion to make it run again, they will not be so happy. Right? It's a different perspective on the same problem. The messaging actually went very fast because it turns out that their speed is not such a big deal. You have to tweak some things, but in the end, people don't type that fast. And so it's okay. You can maybe refresh keys a bit less and then you're fine. So it turns out that, for example, Signal and iMessage did that migration already. I mean, they went to percentages very quickly already in 23, and then they now went very fast with their migration. They're much further now, but so already 2 years ago they did this, and it's not a problem. So this is 2%, but I think they're now much further. Okay. So this is data from Cloudflare again. You can explore all this. It's all available publicly. Cloudflare makes very nice graphs. So they show, for example, which share of HTTPS request traffic is already post-quantum encrypted. And so they show that, in fact, this is from the last 2 years, I believe. So we're now up to something like 40% already. And Bulgaria, amazingly, is already above 50% for some reason. They pointed this out to Real World Crypto, and I checked it last week, and it is still the case that Bulgaria is doing better than average. But it also shows that it clearly doesn't break everything because it can be done. And it is in a very short time because the standards are relatively new. We went through a very quick migration. Of course, getting the last 10% will be hard. For example, embedded TLS will be harder than the main players. And of course, don't be fooled by this. This is percentage of traffic. It's not percentage of servers. There's, of course, a small number of servers that have all the traffic. And the Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons, they will move quickly. But of course, the problem is, what about all the smaller companies and the smaller servers and the embedded devices and so on? So what they do, of course, is they have hybrid solutions. So you combine, you keep ECC and post-quantum. We call this hybrid. It's very confusing because hybrid until now meant that you do public key encryption or public key cryptography for key establishment and symmetric cryptography for bulk data. We call this hybrid. Now, hybrid means something else. Hybrid means you combine ECC with a post-quantum algorithm of your choice. So it's very bad terminology, but this is what it is. So if you think about it, you can always do or and and. Right? For signing, you can put two signatures, and you can say, I accept the signature if both are correct or if one of them is correct. And of course, if one of them is correct, that's OK. And that means also that you can upgrade gradually. It means that those devices are not upgraded, still work. They just don't check the second signature until they have post-quantum features. So it's much smoother. Of course, it also means that if you can break the signature and the device still doesn't check the other one, you have a problem. Right? So it's, for signatures, you're actually kind of in good shape because you can start introducing extra signatures, which creates overhead, but nothing breaks. At least if the overhead in communication and signature size doesn't break now. Public key encryption, of course, is very different. There, if you encrypt your session key once with ECC and once with ML-Chem, well, then you have no long-term security. Because your opponent will store your data now, and in 2040, when they have the computer, they will decrypt and get your session key. So if you want long-term security today, you should encrypt your session key, well, first, say with the ECC algorithm, and then with ML-Chem. And in AND, which also means that if the other side doesn't speak ML-Chem well, then they can't communicate with you. So it's a hard upgrade. And of course, I simplify here because there is also lots of technical issues for security proofs and how do you derive the key and so on. So this is, it's not just as easy as it is here. I'm simplifying here, but you'll get more details later this week on how these things are to be done properly. And of course, hopefully by 2040 or so, we have this computer, or hopefully not, whatever your point of view, and then we will dump ECC because there is no point in dealing with this. So the problem we face is we have 60 billion libraries, applications, devices that have to be upgraded, and we have about 10 years. In fact, 10 years is not fast enough. Right? Ideally, we should be done by the end of this year. Or by the end of maybe 2030 if you want 10 years security for encryption, and 2035 for signature, something like this, or 2039 if you really like to play it risky for signatures. But so it's an amazing problem. It's a massive software migration. So we're now a victim of the success of cryptography. We put it everywhere, and now we have to replace it everywhere. And it's everywhere hard-coded. So for the young people among you, this is job security for 15 years. It's an interesting job, I don't know. It's shouting to a lot of people to change things, who don't want to change things. It's also very difficult to convince them because you have to tell them you have to spend millions or billions to change your system. And then they ask, what will I get? Well, the same as what you have now. is not a very good business case. In general, managers don't like this, that they have to spend a lot of money and just to get the same as what they had before. So this is quite challenging. But I think we should not underestimate this, and Mike Osborne and maybe Christiane will talk about this more. This is going to be a very interesting world. Many of you are too young for the Y2K problem, but the Y2K problem was peanuts compared to this. So the NSA, I mean, now you understand why they're so nervous. I guess they do illegal things. So they're nervous. So they actually published their timeline already in 22. And they said you should start your transitioning in 25. And you should be completed for networking and software signing by 2030. So even for signatures, they're very worried. And then all the rest, operating system, browsers, legacy, is 2023. So more or less they gave all their suppliers 11 years to be done. Which, at least they're realistic, it's a realistic schedule, but then on the other hand, the standards are only available here, so it was not so easy, I guess, for the suppliers. Also interesting, they don't have Sphinx. They have, so this is before the names were given, and they have security level 5. And they have no Falcon either. So very simple choices and only the highest security. And no hybrid mode, so nobody understands this. The NSA has said no hybrid. More or less you dump all your RSA and all your ECC, which made quite some NATO allies upset because the NSA had been shouting at them for decades, upgrade to Suite B. Suite B is AES plus ECC. And so all the France, Germany, they had to update all their systems to ECC. And then in 2015, they said, oh, you can stop your upgrade. And now in 2022, they say, no, dump it all. You can throw away all these devices. You have to move to post-quantum security. NIST published a draft. As long as they exist, I guess they will keep updating it. In fact, there is some indications, as we will see, that they will not be abolished. So they more or less said, you have time till 2035, unless you use smaller key lengths, like RSA 2048, elliptic curve of 112-bit security, so the counterpart, then you should actually probably upgrade to larger key length by 2031 and then finish your update by 2035. So this is more or less what they say. And then, very interesting, the White House, so one of the last days in office, Biden published an executive order, which is very interesting. And it says many things. It said you should secure BGP and DNS. You should encrypt your emails, really. We're trying this already for 30 years. End-to-end encryption of voice and video conferencing, right? They realized that what you get offered as a service is not good enough. And then they said TLS 3 should be required. And I think the most interesting or most surprising is that agencies shall implement PQC key establishment or hybrid key establishment, including a PQC algorithm, as soon as practicable. So don't wait any longer. And there is more in there about things. I will show it on the next slide. But there was a very long document that was published, and until a week ago, it had not been rescinded. So Trump didn't have time. He was too busy with other things. But then he did this actually June 6th, just in time for this course. He decided to change the plans. But in fact, he didn't change that much. So what he actually changed, he put a date, because again, I don't read the whole executive order. If you want to find out what's in the order, you have to read it. But more or less, he put a date. So the US government has to produce a list of product categories that support PQC by December 1st of this year. So there was kind of requirement in Biden's executive order, but now actually there is a hard date on this. And so the requirements for agencies to support TLS 1.3 have to be issued by January 2, also 2030. So this is, he also put a date there where Biden didn't have a date. And this date is 2030. He did remove a lot, but nothing that important. So if you actually, the US government issues a call for tender, the Biden executive order said you have to require PQC support, or you have to require whether your product supports PQC. This has been removed. The as soon as practical sentence has been removed. So there is no more guidance that if you can do it, you should do it. So more or less it's more procrastination. And there was also language on international collaboration that has been removed. So the Europeans no longer have to submit to the NIST competition, don't bother. Don't post your comments to NIST anymore. It's unclear what the implications are in practice, but at least there is no more plan to collaborate with other nations on this. So, but in the end, not too much change in any case. And what did Europe do? Well, in April last year, Europe told the member states that they should develop a plan. So Europe made a plan to make a plan, and this plan is to ask the member states to make a plan. And why is this? Because there is this very long fight, but the legal basis of the EU is the Treaty of Lisbon. And Article 4 of the Treaty of Lisbon says that national security is the competence of the member states. And every time that the European Commission wants to touch cryptography, several member states shout very loudly, "Stay off, this is our business, this is national security." And of course, there have been friction there because, for example, Europe has GDPR, and GDPR says you have to adequately protect your data. So NIST said, we're going to make guidelines on what is adequate encryption, but then every time the member states fight back. So, but then the member states made a working group in which they listened to the academics. So PQC, our project was invited, PQCSA, and some others, but for the rest, we're not involved in the process. There is some indirect contacts. But I think the member states realized that this was they should do more. So in fact, they published a call last November to actually have a roadmap by 2026. So this is also what our project is now contributing to, but in general, it's still the member states are in the driving seat and they're having their own meetings and they're very reluctant to have academics or even industry give direct involvement. So they don't have the same approach as NIST, where you make a plan, you publish your draft and you ask comments and then you decide whether you accept the comments or not. But at least it's a transparent process. The EU, it's still driven by the member states and it's still like, secret meetings in Brussels where only member state representatives are invited. And once in a while they'll come out with some stuff or they post something or they'll have an event where you can comment, but in general there is no open process. That's the big problem of the EU. So there's also two projects, so PQCSA, the one organizing this course. There is also Picasso, another project doing kind of these things. Of course, writing such a roadmap should be a community effort, so everybody should work at this. This is also why we have workshops, for example, in November with automotive sector, and we also engage with NIST in September. There will be another workshop. So it's not only about it's not only technology discussion, this is a discussion like how can you migrate, what should migrate first, and what should you do. And then surprise, surprise, 2 months ago, in fact, Europe did publish something because there is a cybersecurity certification group, the SOGIAS group, and this group manages common criteria standards because, I guess you have heard of common criteria? So if you have a product, you can have it evaluated. And the idea in the 70s was to build secure computers. And we had the Rainbow series, so the Orange Book in the US was part of this. And then in the 90s, ISO made common criteria. And this is a set of rules how to evaluate products for functionality and assurance. And so, for example, if you want to have a secure smart card for banking, you need to have typically AL4, AL4+. So it's a scale from 1 to 7, and AL1 means nothing. It means there are specs, and I looked at them quickly, and AL7 means formally verified. These certifications are very expensive and very slow, especially in higher levels. They cost hundreds of thousands to millions of euros. And they also mean that if you develop a product, you need a second person next to the engineer that makes the chip, need one engineer that makes specifications and writes a meter of specifications for a complex product. It's a meter of paper. And then you have to wait a year to have this thing reviewed. And so this common criteria were an ISO standard, but still every member state had their own rules. And so then Europe made the Cybersecurity Act, 2019-20. And then after 5 years debating in the member states, they debated that they finally came to the conclusion that the common criteria are common. So in fact, that they will now finally be recognition between member states, and then now common cryptographic standards. And so guys published this, and this was then somehow finally handed over to NIST. So this is good, because now at least these standards are public. The problem is still there is no transparency about the creation of these standards. So this is standards for common criteria evaluated product. This is a very small part of the market. This is smart cards, a few routers, a few things, because common criteria evaluation is too small, too expensive and too slow. You cannot do it for complex things. Like you cannot have your Android phone evaluated for common criteria, but you can have a secure element inside it evaluated. So what did they say? Well, they added lattice-based photochem and MLchem in hybrid mode. Then something I don't understand at all, nobody understands, is they actually want to phase out RSA 2048, even 2999, by the end of 2025. So they do nothing for years and arguing about everything for years, and then in April they say, and by December you should get rid of RSA 2048. I mean, I assume it is for products certified after this date, you have to submit, you can no longer get a product. I assume what it means, because I don't think they can rip out all the Belgian identity cards, because they still use RSA 2048 and their common criteria certified. But still, it's kind of baffling that nothing happens for a long time, and then suddenly they come with this date. I mean, if you're in a company and you have these products, and they tell you in April that by December, your product has to remove RSA 2048 and go to RSA 3072, this is kind of a very short time. Maybe as an academic, it doesn't sound like a very short time, but if it's a certified product, it means you have to have certified code, test it, and so on, update all your documentation. It's kind of a nightmare. And of course, there is no transparent process for review. They just publish this and say, here it is. And they can come next month with a new document, and nobody knows what's happening. Okay, so time to wrap up. So if you look at people developing applications in software, there is the OWASP top 10. This is like where things go wrong. And number 2 is cryptographic failures. But if you look at those, one is like weak algorithms, but there is also a failure of no encryption, which is still happening as well, or bad randomness, or certificate management, or default keys. So it seems that weak algorithms is only like one concern in a long list of concerns. On the other hand, if you look at OWASP top 10 in detail, and you look at, it's a bit hard to see, but the ones things that are in red, well, many of these things can actually be mitigated by cryptography and use public key cryptography to mitigate them. So more or less, this is more like a message to software developers, or you can show to people, say, oh, your cryptography is only a small thing. No, in fact, if you look at the real software security issues, about half of them are affected or mitigated by cryptographic protections. And if you don't fix them, you'll end up with big software security issues. Okay, so what's happening? So you'll hear about more from this from Mike and Christiana on Thursday. So what's happening first in the financial sector, but it's going to go to all the sectors. So now as companies, you have to start looking at what cryptography do you have? Because most companies don't even know. And large banks may have thousands of applications. They may even have PKI infrastructure they don't know about, because there was an application, a new product, and some engineer decided that to get this working, you need the PKI, so he just built a CA somewhere and run this, and the bank management doesn't even know about it. This is very common. And so now, of course, there is this kind of crypto inventory, but the problem is, and Mike Osborne will show you the graphs, a crypto inventory is a spaghetti. You should not think that a company has 15 cryptographic applications and you make a simple plan to upgrade those in the next 10 years. No, a company probably has like thousands of applications, and you have to decide which ones you're going to fix, which ones you never fix, which ones we will dump and when. And then even if you decide you want to fix it, you will find out that, well, this product uses libraries from suppliers or hardware products from other vendors. So you have to start shouting at your vendors and say, when will you upgrade this? And the vendor will say, I don't know, I depend on another vendor. I'm going to shout at him as well. So there is a lot of shouting happening now. And it's a very, very complex problem. You have an ecosystem, as I said, with 60 billion devices, applications. You have thousands of 10,000s of players. And the big question is who will pay for it, right? Because if you can tell your vendor, I'm going to pay a lot of money, upgrade your product, that's fine. But if you tell your vendor, change your product because I want it, and what are you going to pay? Oh, nothing. Then you have a problem. So where will the move happen? In the financial sector, because there the regulators will come in. Central banks will tell, for example, Israel and Singapore already have issued requirements to the banks to do stuff. And I think the other central banks are going to do this. And then, of course, the banks will start shouting at their suppliers, which is big tech, but also many other vendors. So this is happening right now as I speak. This is happening. Then the other sectors that will start moving is automotive. They're already working on this. Why? Because if you design a car today, then it will be on the road in 2 or 3 years, and hopefully it will drive for the next 20 years. And so this means it's beyond 2040, and you still want to do secure updates by then. So, and changing the hardware in a car is very expensive. You have to do recalls. You don't want to do that. It's very bad for your image, and it's very expensive. So what is easy is messaging. As I showed you, it's already happening. TLS is relatively easy, although it's still going to take 10 years to get all to post-quantum version of TLS 1.3. Secure boot and update, this is very difficult because embedded devices, not technologically, but all these embedded devices, they're very hard to change. Webcams, dishwashers, washing machines, and so on. All those things, they now use cryptography. Have you recently tried to buy one of those white goods? So I did. So it's very hard today to buy a washing machine or a dryer or a dishwasher that's not on the internet. If you don't want it, it's very, very hard. I tried and I failed. For my dryer, I failed. And you can say, oh, I switch it off. Well, in fact, to then operate it, you don't get all the functionality unless you install the app and connect it to the internet. So they actually deny some programs to you unless you actually get it on the internet. And of course, you think it's post-quantum secure, this dryer? Of course not. And do you think they will upgrade it ever? Of course not. That's not in their business model, right? They rather shut it off than actually upgrade it. So I would say interesting times ahead. So PKI is going to be very hard because we already know that some middle boxes break and clients break when you get certificate chains of tens of kilobytes. Platforms are very hard, like big cloud platforms. Things like EMV, global platform, all these kind of large infrastructures with thousands of players. This is going to be a nightmare because who will move what and by when? And of course, what everybody can say is that, of what we tell people is, look, you're not going to migrate from, say, elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman to MLChem, but these lattice things, they're not new. I mean, you know lattices for a long time, but there is lots of optimizations in there, and so maybe, make sure that if we tell you to go to PhotoChem, it doesn't take another 10 years. It kind of makes sense to no longer hard-code algorithms and be able to make it more flexible. And this is, again, as an academic, easy to say, but in practice, it's, of course, very hard to do because you have to have more memory and you have to then think all the implications are, how you will indicate which algorithm is used, how you will, like TLS has this algorithm negotiation capability. It's actually very hard to do it in practice securely. It sounds easy, but these are things which are hard. So this is kind of what academics can shout. Crypto agility, make sure that your next migration will be easy. But I think the companies are with this, just with the basic migration. And if you tell them, and now you should make it flexible, I think they will suffer a lot. But this is where the long-term goal should be for sure. Okay, this I will leave to Mike. I think we should stop, but the one slide message is QKD is not going to solve your problem. Okay, it solves some niche problems. If you have 2 headquarters and you have a dedicated fiber optic cable and you really don't want to use cryptography and you want to do something cool, well, do QKD. It's very cool. And the research coming out is fantastic, but it doesn't solve the problem of the 60 billion devices. It solves the problem of the maybe 100,000 devices. In a very cool way. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I'm worried about the 60 billion, not about the 100,000. And what Europe is doing is the opposite. Europe is spending hundreds of millions on the QKD, and they're spending tens of millions on the post-quantum. It's kind of the wrong way around. Okay, here's more details. So time to stop. So we don't know for sure when this really large quantum computer will be available. Nobody knows whether it will hit a barrier or not, or whether there will be breakthroughs. I mean, there will be breakthroughs, as I told you. There will be one every 6 months, I promise you. But that doesn't mean we will get there, right? There may still be a wall we're hitting. But more or less, it doesn't matter because some important people, governments, banks, central banks have decided that we can no longer take the risk. So this debate is over. You should start your migration. You should, of course, look at risks because you will not be able to migrate everything. There are 60 billion devices. Some applications will be dumped. I think some banks will finally dump some systems that exist with COBOL for 30 years. They're finally going to dump it because they don't know how to make it post-quantum secure. That will be a good thing. So, of course, the message is make sure you can replace your crypto easier, but this is kind of easier said than done. And we should probably do more work on protocols for this. And the EU should get their act together, but this is a very big problem because the member states don't want it to happen. And I guess quantum computers will bring other cool stuff. So, I mean, we always think of the negative, but there will be very cool stuff, you know, new medicine, new materials. There will be amazing new thing happening if these computers are there. But UKD will not be a solution. And so in case this is not competing with this course, but Alphonse Menezes, I'm working with him. He's actually close to retirement, and to fill his time, he's making videos about cryptography. And he also recently made a series of videos on post-quantum cryptography. So if you want those people not so lucky, they can come to this course, or if you want to revisit material later or show it to other people, it's all available for free. And Alfred is a very good speaker, so I just recommend this to you. I'll also give you the links where all things are happening, but I think it's time to stop and give you your well-deserved coffee break. Okay, thank you for your attention.